Silent Hill 2 has 8 different endings, 3 that can be achieved on your first playthrough, and 5 more that can only be accessed by meeting specific conditions on New Game Plus. Let's take some time to review all 8, examine what it takes to get them, and consider what they tell us about James, Mary, and the overall story of Silent Hill 2. Before we get to the endings themselves, first we need to talk about the third and final act of the game, so that we can have a good foundation to build off of moving forward. In Silent Hill 2's closing hours, James arrives at Lakeview Hotel in search of a videotape he and Mary made together the last time they were here, during the vacation to Silent Hill that we hear about quite a few times throughout the game. James will find that videotape in a safe in the basement, and after solving the music box puzzle, he'll reach room 312, the room he and Mary stayed in during their vacation. This is the so-called special place that James has been looking for all along. There, James will find a VCR, which he can use to play the tape. The tape starts out normal and heartfelt, with Mary asking James to promise her that he'll bring her back to Silent Hill someday, and saying that it was once considered to be a sacred location. Some of this, especially the part about coming back to Silent Hill, was echoed in Mary's letter. Suddenly, the scene shifts to Mary's bedroom. We hear her breathing heavily, and though it's shot in a purposefully ambiguous manner and from various points of view, the end result is clear. James kills Mary by suffocating her with a pillow. Beyond that, it really is ambiguous. We don't see James's face. We don't know if he's making an expression of anger or sadness. We don't know what he was thinking at the time or what his reasons were. That's largely dependent on the ending you get, and even then, your personal reading of James's character will strongly influence your final verdict there. We don't know what happened before the murder, or what James and Mary were talking about before she fell asleep. In the leave ending, Mary says that she told James that she wanted the pain to end, and it's possible that these were her last words to him before the murder. But in the Maria ending, she says that James robbed her of the last precious moment she had, which makes it sound like she wanted to stay alive a while longer. All we know for certain is that he killed her. That's all Team Silent wanted to show us back in 2001, and here in 2024, Bloober Team has only made things more muddled. It is supposed to be open to interpretation and debate. No two people are going to play up to this point in Silent Hill 2, watch this scene, and come away with the same take on James Sunderland's actions. It's part of what made the original an all-time classic, and now the remake is introducing a whole new audience to Silent Hill 2's bold and complicated storytelling. That having been said, there are a few cold hard facts about Mary's death that we need to establish before we move on. First, in Mary's letter to James, which is read aloud to us in 2 of the endings, Mary mentions that she's been given permission to go back home. This indicates that the murder took place at James and Mary's house. Some fans speculate that they lived in Ashfield, where part of Silent Hill 4, The Room, is set. Furthermore, this also suggests that the long hallway conversation, which we'll dive into very soon here, was not the last conversation James and Mary had before he killed her. We know this because, in that conversation, Mary mentions that James brought her flowers, makes specific references to the hospital she's staying in, and yells at James to leave and go home. Obviously, he can't leave and go home if they're already home, which tells us that this conversation took place at some point earlier. Personally, I suspect that the long hallway conversation took place during James's last visit to her in the hospital, the visit before he came to pick her up and bring her home. This also explains why the cops aren't actively looking for James. No one knows that he killed his wife, because he did it while they were at home and not surrounded by nurses and doctors. And as for Mary's death itself, some view it as a mercy killing. Others, a straight-up murder committed by a selfish husband who wanted his wife out of the way. Some folks argue that it's something in between. The various endings that follow leave plenty of room for all 3 interpretations. But make no mistake, what James did here definitely wasn't planned. In the video, we see James sneaking up on Mary while she's sleeping, and we also see signs of a struggle, evidenced by this camera shot here, which shows Mary grabbing James's arm, and the sounds that accompany all of this. So while there are many acceptable interpretations behind the reasons for James's actions, and though, depending on the ending, You can make the case that Mary wanted to die, that she wanted the pain to end. You cannot make the case that this is an assisted suicide or something along those lines. Because in that moment, Mary doesn't know what's happening to her, and she resists. So either James pulled a George and Lenny from Of Mice and Men, or he did something far more sinister. With the tape over, James admits what he did, and even comes clean about it to Laura, in a scene that just fucking guts me. The acting here is brilliant, and you can clearly see just how much Laura loved Mary, and how guilty James is. After Laura chews James out and leaves, there's an otherworld transition, but not in the direction you'd expect. You'd be forgiven for thinking that what happens here is that we shift from the real world's Lakeview Hotel to the otherworld Lakeview Hotel. But it's actually the opposite. As it turns out, we've been in the otherworld Lakeview Hotel since we arrived. The real one was torched in a fire sometime after James and Mary stayed there on vacation, meaning that as the fog dissipates and James sits alone in the hotel room, we're actually leaving Otherworld and returning to the real town of Silent Hill. This is a topic that Masahiro Ito has talked about a few times in the past, and brought up again now that folks are discussing and analyzing the remake. Masahiro Ito, for those who are unaware, was the creature designer for the first 3 Silent Hill games, and the creator of Pyramid Head. Bloober Team brought him on to help with the remake, which, if you ask me, is a big part of why it turned out so well. What this tells us is that in James's Otherworld, despite how hellish it is in locations like Woodside Apartments and Brookhaven Hospital, Lakeview Hotel, his special place with Mary, is exactly as he remembers it from his vacation. Well, mostly. It's now abandoned and crawling with weird monsters, but hey, you get the point. In any case, as he sits in the real-world scorched version of Lakeview Hotel, James hears a message from Mary on his radio. Just as she has throughout the game, she says that she's waiting for him. But this time, she sounds desperate, asking him if he hates her, telling him that he's close, and begging him not to give up. As James progresses through the burned hotel, you'll notice that the monsters he encounters are noticeably weaker, and don't really attack him, which, as I see it, is a sign that our protagonist is indeed nearing the conclusion of his journey, and that soon enough, he won't need these monsters anymore. For better or for worse. Eventually, James will encounter Angela Orozco, who's at the end of her own Silent Hill odyssey. Her heartbreaking story will need its own video, but to provide a quick analysis of what's happening here, she's trapped in a burning stairwell, with the defeated bodies of 2 abstract daddies on the wall. Most folks believe them to be representations of Angela's father and brother, who abused her. Angela initially thinks that James is her mother, who she's been looking for throughout the game. She soon realizes that James isn't her mother, just James, and then reveals more of her own trauma, describing how her mother said she deserved to be abused. James tries to talk her down, but Angela is unfazed, and asks him to return her knife. James refuses, and with that, Angela begins to walk up the stairs. It's at this point that James says that it's hot as hell in here, indicating that he can't see the flames. They're only visible to us players and to Angela, who says that for her, it's always like this. Most interpret this to mean that fire is a key component of her own personal otherworld, much like water is to James's and ice is to Eddie's. Angela then heads up the stairs, her final fate unknown. Shortly thereafter, James reaches Silent Hill 2's penultimate boss fight. Pyramid Head is back, and this time he's got backup. A second Pyramid Head. Maria is at their mercy, suspended upside down from a contraption that is reminiscent of both the execution cages of Silent Hill's past and the bed-like frame that surrounds the flesh lips, and later, the game's final boss. Maria begs James to rescue her, but it's no use, as the Pyramid Heads stab her before he can do anything. Then, in one of the game's most powerful moments, James drops to his knees, and at long last, comes to understand the purpose of Pyramid Head. He acknowledges that Pyramid Head is a manifestation of his desire to be punished for killing his wife, and that for a time, he did need him. But all of that is over now, and he's ready to face the truth of what he did. After proving that he is indeed ready by outlasting the duo, the Pyramid Heads will drive their spears into the ground, and impale themselves on the opposite end. When this cutscene is over, each pyramid head will be holding an egg. The rust-colored egg, which represents Mary, and the scarlet egg, which represents Maria. You'll need to place both in the doors in front of you to progress, but which one you pass through will influence what happens next. Thus, it's from here that the endings begin to deviate in earnest. So let's start things off with the leave ending. To get the leave ending, you need to keep your health up throughout the game. As in, don't just walk around the town hobbled and with the red border around your screen. You'll also need to examine the letter from Mary and the photo of Mary in your inventory. It's unclear how many times you need to do this to get the ending, but I got it on my first run despite only looking at these items once, right at the beginning of the game. Because of this, my personal opinion is that leave is the ending that most players probably get on a first blind playthrough of Silent Hill 2. Because unless you know better, you're probably going to check out the letter and the photo at least one time. Another key to achieving this ending is to listen to the full conversation between James and Mary in the long hallway before the final boss fight. Again, this is something that I'd expect most players unfamiliar with the game's ending conditions to do. Of course newcomers are going to want to listen to this conversation. It's pretty critical, so let's break it down here. In the long hallway conversation, Mary shifts between yelling at James and begging him for affection. She starts by chastising him for bringing her flowers, mentions how ugly and disgusting she feels, goes as far as to say that she thinks she looks like a monster, and then screams at him, telling him to leave. When he does start to leave, Mary changes her tone, pleading with him to stay, and asking him for comfort. It's unfortunate to say, but if you've ever known someone in palliative care, mood swings like this are fairly commonplace. When I played Silent Hill 2 as a teenager, I didn't understand it, but now that I've seen my grandmother go through it, and watched several of my friends have to put their parents in adult daycare facilities, this conversation hits like a truck. Because it's a realistic representation of what happens when someone doesn't have that much longer to live. And if we are to fully understand James's character, it's important that we see a scene like this, and witness firsthand the emotional burden that Mary's terminal illness placed on him. Again, I'm not here to tell you how you should feel about what James did. That's entirely open to interpretation. But few people, outside of those who work with such patients day in and day out, are equipped to deal with this type of thing. At the same time, the long hallway conversation tells us quite a bit about Mary and her mental state around the time of the murder. We knew that she was sick and dying, but her dialogue reveals how depressed and helpless she felt in her hospital bed, with only doctors, nurses, Laura, and the occasional visit from James to comfort her. Mary wasn't an old woman by any means. She was young, probably in her 30s or 40s if I were to take a guess at her age. No doubt she had hopes, dreams, and goals of her own. She probably wanted to spend more time traveling with James, and she might have even wanted to have kids. Her terminal illness ruined that possibility, and thus she has every reason to be as emotional as she is here, even aside from the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, folks in palliative care often have moments like this. And as any wife would, in these circumstances, she surely wanted comfort from her husband. Based on Mary's letter, and by his own admission, we know that James struggled to provide that comfort. If James had been better in this regard, if he'd stuck to the vows of in sickness and in health, and visited her more regularly, and been more attentive to her needs, then perhaps he would have known that she had no interest in flowers, something that seems to have set her off right from the beginning here. All of this is to say that even in a generous reading of James's character, I think that the long hallway conversation suggests that James had some serious shortcomings as a husband. It's a really complicated and human situation with lots of valid points of view on the matter, which again is part of what makes Silent Hill 2 such an all-time classic, and an example of some of the best and most authentic writing in all of video games. After leaving the long hallway, James ascends to the top of the hotel, and meets with who he initially believes to be Mary. But he soon realizes that it's not Mary at all. It's Maria, having taken on the form of Mary. He apologizes to her, and says that this can't go on anymore. He knows the truth, that Mary is gone, that he killed her, and that nothing will bring her back. Furious, Maria refuses to back down, and transforms into the game's final boss. In the OG Silent Hill, the name of the final boss was Mary, but the remake simply refers to the entity you fight here as her. Personally, I like this change, as it reflects the fact that there are multiple conversations that can happen here, some with Mary and some with Maria, and leaves further room for interpretation. The battle with her lasts 3 full phases, and even changes arenas a few times. Once she's defeated, she'll collapse, and in order to progress, James will need to hit her one final time with any of his weapons. So essentially, what's happening here is that James is being forced to symbolically reenact what he did back on the videotape when he killed his terminally ill wife. It's dark and gruesome, but it's one of those quiet, metaphorical moments that the remake does so well. Before he can move on to the ending, he needs to accept that he really did kill Mary, one final time. With the boss fight over, James is granted one final conversation with the real Mary. She's affectionate towards him, and though James apologizes for what he did, Mary dismisses this, saying that she told him that she wanted the pain to end. Still feeling guilty, James brings up the selfish reasons he wanted her gone, going as far as to say that he hated her. But Mary shuts this down too, saying that if that's true, then why does he look so sad? She then gives him her real letter, which we see James share with Laura. The game then reads the letter out loud as still shots of Silent Hill are shown on the screen. In the letter, Mary goes into greater detail about how her condition made her feel, and describes how she suffered in her bed, sick, lonely, and depressed. She says that she knows how hard her illness has been on him, that it shows every time he comes to visit. She also expresses that she hopes the pain will end soon, so that James can remember her for the person she was, and not what the disease turned her into. This would seem to support the viewpoint that Mary's death at James's hands was a mercy killing, an interpretation that works well with the Leave ending. But again, whether or not that's really what happened here is entirely up to you. She concludes her letter by telling him that she wants him to move on, to live for himself and others, because he made her happy. As she says this, we see James leave Silent Hill with Laura, implying that he tends to take her in and raise her as his own, something that Mary herself dreamed of doing. It goes without saying that Leave is considered to be the quote, good ending of Silent Hill 2. James accepts that he killed Mary, finds solace in his final conversation with her, and decides to do something kind and productive with his future by adopting Laura. Whether or not James would be capable of being a good father is up for debate, but I personally like to think it's something he would have struggled with at first, but learned to do quite well over time. And regardless, Laura is a lot better off being raised by him than wandering the streets of Silent Hill. If you're looking for creator opinions on the ending, Masahiro Ito says that there's no canon ending to the game, and that he does like Leave, but he believes that James would have turned himself in for killing Mary. So I guess if Ito had his way, he wouldn't have been able to raise Laura after all. And now let's go from the game's most uplifting ending to arguably its bleakest, the in-water ending. You can get this ending by neglecting James's health throughout the game, allowing it to rest at critical levels rather than actively healing. But you can also trigger it later on, if you're so inclined, by inspecting Angela Orozco's knife in your inventory a bunch of times. In this way, the conditions for triggering it have some similarities to Leave, and that an early game item can influence the path that James takes. For this reason, many players shoot for the Maria ending, but save their game before the final boss fight with the 2 pyramid heads, allowing them to examine the picture of Mary to trigger Leave, or the knife to trigger In Water. In any case, just like with Leave, to get the In Water ending, the player will also need to listen to the entire conversation in the long hallway. And fittingly, up on the roof, the scene between James and Maria in the form of Mary plays out just as it does with Leave. After defeating her, the In Water ending truly begins. Sitting in the front seat of his car, James apologizes to Mary, saying that he knows she wants him to move on, but that he just can't let her go. He then glances at his back seat, where many fans had long believed he was keeping Mary's body, something that the remake confirms, and looks down at her unopened letter. James then starts the engine, and drives the car into the lake. The game reads Mary's letter aloud as it descends to the depths of Toluca Lake. The content of the letter is the same, and while it might just be the music, her tone seems noticeably bleaker and more depressing, which leads me to believe it's a different take entirely. Regardless, In Water is truly the opposite of the Leave ending. James acknowledges that he killed Mary and that she's not coming back, but decides that he can't forgive himself or go on without her. In doing so, he rejects Mary's last wishes, her desire for him to move on, and to be the man he was for most of their marriage. To me, that makes In Water the game's quote, bad ending, but there are bleak elements to all of the non-joke endings, so it's really up to you to decide which one is deserving of that title. That said, many players, going back to the original game, consider the In Water ending to be the game's canon ending. This largely has to do with the fact that, as I just covered, Mary's body has been in the back seat of James's car all along. Furthermore, James's original voice actor, Guy Seehey, prefers this ending, and is the one used in the original game's novelization. Ito has said that he likes this ending, along with Leave, and acknowledges its popularity with fans. Now, as mentioned earlier, Leave and In Water are fairly easy endings to manipulate, at least in theory. But the third standard ending for the game is notoriously tricky to get, and that's the Maria ending. To get the Maria ending, you need to, generally speaking, show as much interest in Maria as possible. Stay close to her when she's accompanying you, protect her from monsters as best you can, and talk with her every chance you get. All of this works on something of a reputation system, which makes it tricky to gauge, but other factors that are reported to influence this ending include using the ripe apple instead of the rotten apple in the mirror puzzle, going through the door you place the scarlet egg into instead of the door you placed the rusted egg into after your battle with the two pyramid heads, and leaving your personal items, like Mary's photo and letter, behind in the locker when you enter the service elevator in Lakeview Hotel. And unlike the Leave and In Water endings, which call for you to listen to the entire conversation in the long hallway before the boss fight with her, to get the Maria ending, you should sprint through the hallway as quickly as possible, with the goal of reaching the door before it's over. Interestingly, if you start sprinting the second you enter the long hallway, you'll reach the end while Mary is yelling at James, before her demeanor changes and she starts to look to him for comfort. Which, I'd say, reflects that in this version of events, James let the moments where Mary was angry about her illness deeply affect him, and focused little on the moments where she wanted his affection. Prior to the final boss fight, an entirely different cutscene plays out. This time, James doesn't talk to Maria pretending to be Mary. He's straight up talking to Mary. And what she says here changes, well, everything. As mentioned during our discussion of the Leave ending, in that version of events, it sounds like Mary did want to die. But in the Maria ending, that's definitely not the case at all. Because here, Mary yells at James, saying that he killed her. This, of course, is true in every version of events, but for her to say it like this suggests that she didn't want to die. Then she accuses James of trying to replace her with Maria. And after defeating her, that's exactly what James does. He returns to Heaven's Night, where he reunites with Maria. The fact that this is where he finds her says a lot about his motivations. Heaven's Night is a strip club, so by meeting her here, of all places, the developers are really emphasizing James's sexual frustration and all the other selfish reasons he had for wanting Mary gone. Speaking of Mary, he has her letter in this ending, but rather than open it, he pockets it, again signaling his desire to cast her aside in favor of Maria. James and Maria then leave Silent Hill, but before they do, Maria coughs, just like Mary does on the videotape, indicating that she, perhaps, is about to suffer the same fate as her alter ego. The cyclical nature of this ending has led many to believe that James is in a recurring loop, not unlike the protagonist of Silent Hills, I suppose you could say. Evidence for this, beyond the ending itself, includes the references to the concept of samsara throughout the game, and the fact that all of the human bodies, including those murdered by Eddie, look like James. Thus, some believe that the Maria ending is just a step along the path, until James ultimately accepts Mary's death and either moves on, as he doesn't leave, or decides to end it all, as is the case with In Water. As far as the base game is concerned, that's it for the endings. In New Game Plus, there are 5 more, one that dates back to the OG Silent Hill 2, 2 new ones created by Bloober Team, and 2 joke endings. Let's start with the final one from the original game, Rebirth. To achieve this ending, you'll need to gather 4 items on your New Game Plus run. The items are as follows: the Crimson Ceremony Book, which can be found in the graveyard after meeting with Angela Orozco, the White Chrism, which rests on a table outside of Baldwin Manor, the Obsidian Goblet, tucked away in a cubby in the Silent Hill Historical Society, and finally, the Lost Memories Book, which you'll find on a shelf in the Lost and Found area of Lakeview Hotel. If you're on a run to see all 8 endings, which is possible to do on New Game Plus, I'd recommend saving your game immediately before picking up the Lost Memories book, because as soon as it hits your inventory, you're locked into Rebirth. From there, the path to the Rebirth ending progresses as per usual. James still sees the ambiguous videotape. He still fights Ornstein and Smo. Pyramid Head and Pyramid Head. And he still battles her at the top of Lakeview Hotel. Though this time, a third variation of his conversation with Mary/Maria will play out. Here, it's once again Maria posing as Mary. But rather than reject her because he knows the truth, he instead declares that Mary isn't truly gone, because he's found a way to bring her back. True though this may be, he sounds completely fucking delusional in this scene, and very clearly hasn't accepted what he did. After defeating her, a cutscene will play showing James rowing out across Toluca Lake, presumably to the island where the exiled woman lived in the folktale referenced throughout the game. He's got Mary's body with him, up in the front of his boat. He apologizes for, quote, waking her, but says that he can't go on without her, and then declares that the old gods of Silent Hill still remain in the resort town, and that they still offer aid to those who venerate them. This implies that he intends to perform an occult ritual to bring Mary back to life. This ending is decently popular with the fanbase, especially those who entered the series with Silent Hill 1, as its mention of old gods and occult rituals is a callback to the first game. I like it because it's tonally quite different than the others, but still gestures towards the possibility of the loop theory being a thing. For the record, I'm not sure that I'm a proponent of that theory myself, but I do like that the remake makes a point of continuing to honor it in its own subtle way. After decades lost in the fog, we should cherish the things about Silent Hill that made us keep coming back to the resort town, and fan theories are certainly one of those things. Now, let's move on to the 2 new endings. First up, let's talk about the Stillness ending, or as some folks are calling it, In Water 2.0. And appropriately, to get this ending, you have to have first unlocked In Water. So if you're out there trying to make it happen, make sure that you've achieved that one first. In addition, you'll also need to get the chainsaw from the Silent Hill Ranch, and use it to acquire the Key of Sorrow from a green car on Wiltsey Road. Then, once you reach the real version of Lakeview Hotel, use the key on the safe in the manager's office on the first floor, and enter the combination to get the Toluca Lake postcard. Inspect the postcard at least once, and you should be good to go. Structurally, this ending is indeed very similar to In Water. James is sitting in his car, back where he started the game, when he expresses how much he misses Mary, and how he can't forgive himself for killing her. It's at this point that he seems to imagine Mary talking to him. She asks him what's wrong, calls him honey, and touches his face. He asks her if she'll wait for him, and she says that she'll always be waiting for him. The fact that we don't see Mary's eyes in this scene and only see her lips move when she says that last part has led some to suspect that there might be something sinister going on here, but I personally don't see it that way. James then looks down at the letter from Mary and starts the engine. But if you listen closely, there's a pause before the car drives into the water, which isn't there for the In Water ending. And the sounds in general are slightly different, and thus some folks speculate that James got out of the car in this ending. In light of this, I've seen folks interpret Stillness 2 different ways. To some, the fact that it sounds like James got out of the car, combined with his brief conversation with Mary about how she's waiting for him, suggests that this isn't an ending at all, but rather a prologue. That this is what happens immediately before we take control of James at the beginning of the game. I don't really agree with this interpretation, but I can see where they're coming from. If true, it would mean that this is the moment where James represses Mary's death, confuses 3 years with but a single day, and decides to go looking for her in Silent Hill. It's pretty interesting to think about, but again, I don't think it's very likely. Another take on this scene is that it is basically the same as In Water, except for the fact that James gets out of the car before it drives into Toluca Lake, thus sending Mary's body alone into its depths. If so, it's almost a halfway point between Leave and In Water. James accepts what he did, but can't forgive himself. So he essentially buries Mary's body, and then decides to go on with his life, waiting until the day that he gets to meet her again in whatever afterlife he subscribes to. Coming into the remake, I was very, very leery about the fact that Bloober Team was adding endings to the game. Actually, to say I was leery is a bit of an understatement. I fucking hated it. But as the game went on, and I saw how lovingly they adapted this all-time classic, I became so encouraged by their work that I was interested to see how these endings would compare to the existing 4. And I think Stillness is a worthy addition to the collection. It honors the popularity of In Water, while also adding a new twist to it that says something of its own, without editorializing either. That's not easy to do with a game as established and praised as Silent Hill 2. Based on what I've seen, the community, for the most part, seems to agree with me on this. The acting in this scene is spectacular, which really sells it, and I've seen some folks go as far as to say that it's their new favorite ending to the game. I truly never thought I'd hear that when I found out new endings were going to be introduced to Silent Hill 2, and for that, Bloober Team deserves some serious props. I like it myself, but it's not my favorite. I'll tell you which ending I prefer at the end of this video, but I can see why some folks feel that way. It really does mix Leave and In Water very well. James accepts what he did, and struggles to move on, to the point where he considers ending it all in the lake with Mary, but decides to keep going anyway. A broken, guilty man who's come to terms with some things, but still isn't all the way there yet. The second of the game's new endings is called Bliss. To get this ending, James will need to acquire a substance called White Claudia from a safe in Pete's Bolorama. White Claudia is a hallucinogen used in rituals by the cult of Silent Hill. It first appeared in Silent Hill 1, and it's popped up in several of the other games as well. When you get to Lakeview Hotel, before you watch the videotape, the tape where it's revealed that James killed Mary, drink the White Claudia and interact with the VCR as you normally do. The videotape will start out as it usually does, with Mary asking James to bring her back to Silent Hill someday. But just before the ambiguous murder typically takes place, things shift entirely, as James walks into the frame and embraces Mary. The apparently happy couple then realizes that they need to get packing. Must be checkout day. James heads over into the corner and zones out for a moment, at which point Mary asks him if something happened. He responds that everything is fine, and legitimately smiles for the first time in the entire game, before the screen cuts to static. The game ends with a final shot of the hotel room, with James gone from the chair. There are several ways to interpret this, but what stands out to me, first and foremost, is that, as mentioned earlier, White Claudia is a hallucinogen, and a powerful one at that. So, at a base level, I think we can definitely say that our boy James is on one hell of a drug trip during this scene. But why does he vanish? And what's up with the moment where he appears to zone out? Well, I might be reading too much into this, but let me play that moment for you again one more time.
James, honey, did something happen?
That part where Mary checks in with James sounds eerily similar to this line right here from Maria.
James? Is everything alright?
She says this when you save the game in her presence, which makes me wonder if he's doing something similar here. No, not literally. I'm not saying that James is saving his game here, don't get it twisted. Rather, I think that perhaps the game is suggesting that he is symbolically choosing to stay here, to persist in this memory, to dwell on the past instead of moving forward, and it's using something meta, in this case the save game feature, to demonstrate that. Hell, even the way he blinks out is similar to what we see when you save your game. So I really do think there's something there. It would also help explain why he disappears from the hotel room, because he's forever lost in the fog, forever trapped in the happy memories of the past. I don't think this ending is as strong an addition to the list as Stillness. That ending just threads the needle so damn well. But it's still pretty good, because it has something of its own to say. How many of us, if we were in James's shoes, would choose to persist in the past rather than move on? It's tragic, sad, and relatable, something that is only heightened by the fact that James does indeed look truly happy here. There's something about it that reminds me of some of the concepts explored in Inception in that way. And now, on to the two joke endings. The first is the dog ending. In this ending, James discovers that a devious pupper has been behind everything that's been happening to him throughout the game. To get this ending, you'll have to combine two broken key parts to make the dog key. The first, fittingly, can be found at the pet center in the eastern side of South Vale. And the second, also fittingly, can be found in a dog house you can find in the western side of South Vale after you meet up with Maria. As for the second joke ending, the UFO ending, to get this one, you'll have to acquire the blue gem from South Vale Jewelers and then use it in 4 locations: on the roof of Saul's apartments, at Rosewater Park's pier, at Lakeview Hotel's dock, and finally, in room 312 itself. Upon doing so, you'll get the ending. James will head out onto the balcony, where he'll be abducted by the original Silent Hill 2's James, and an alien in a comedic scene that should bring some serious laughs to all longtime fans. Now that we've covered all 8 endings in detail, let's get into the debate and discussion portion of this video. Which of these endings do I think is the best ending? Which one is the most fitting conclusion to the gripping and human story of James and Mary? Well, interestingly enough, the remake has changed my feelings on the matter. When I first played Silent Hill 2 way back in the day, I got the leave ending on my first run, and though I thought that it was a very satisfying conclusion, it didn't seem appropriate. The original James Sunderland, voiced by Guy Seehee, often came off as aloof and rather clueless. Because of this, I was more inclined to believe that though Mary probably did want to die, it wasn't a mercy killing, but rather James's selfishness and his desire to be rid of her that motivated him to suffocate her. Thus, I preferred the in-water ending. It just seemed to be the natural conclusion to James's narrative arc. But here in 2024, the remake has changed my opinion completely. The remake's James Sunderland, played by Luke Roberts, who, fun fact, took on the role of the legendary Sir Arthur Dane in HBO's Game of Thrones, comes off in a far more sympathetic light. He's kinder to both Angela and Eddie, and even when he has his issues with Laura, he seems more annoyed with her than pissed off, which is how he sounded in the original, at least to me. He's also noticeably hesitant around Maria, but still seems to care for her in a way that I see as good-natured rather than needy. And most importantly, his every word and movement is full of emotion, full of regret, guilt, and trauma. It's far easier for me to believe that this James Sunderland killed Mary out of mercy and is struggling with it because he's a decent person who knows he wasn't always the best husband, that he did, at times, have selfish reasons for wanting her gone. And to me, the best conclusion for this James Sunderland is leave. Mary acknowledges that she wanted to die, and he gets closure on those selfish reasons when she dismisses them entirely. As Mary herself says,
"If that's true, then why do you look so sad?"
To me, that question encapsulates everything that James Sunderland is. That's why he's a fucking mess throughout Silent Hill 2. That's why the town has its way with him for the better part of our 16-hour journey. Because he's not a monster. He's a complicated character who did a terrible thing in the name of mercy, and is struggling with it because at his core, he really did love his wife, and the thought that he might have killed her because he was selfish tears him up inside, to the point where he's invented a great knife-wielding tormentor based on the horrifying executioners of Silent Hill's past to punish him over and over again. James looks so fucking sad because he killed his wife so she wouldn't have to suffer anymore, but is scared to death that he did it for all the wrong reasons. I also love that he leaves with Laura. I have my doubts about his ability to be a good father, like I said earlier, but from a symbolic standpoint, it does provide him the opportunity for redemption. We love our last-minute face turns, like with Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi. But it's important to remember that redemption is a process, and I think the Leave ending, where James departs from Silent Hill with Laura at his side, provides him with the chance to fully engage in that process. And that makes it an ending that from multiple perspectives I can really get behind. But that's just what I think. What do you guys think is the best ending to Silent Hill 2? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching. Big thanks to Mathias T. Taylor, Solice, and David Peppiatt for allowing me to use their covers from the Silent Hill soundtrack for this video. To check out all their music, just follow the links to their channel pages down below in the description box. Big shout out to all my Silver and Gold tier YouTube channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Lil Caesar, Reed, Pathonian, Faith G, and Anna Novakova, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time.